Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first TA Live webinar of the 2020-2021 school year. We're so excited to have you all here. My name is Candace McIntyre. I am a Deaf Education and Training Specialist with the Resource Materials and Technologies Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Today, we're going to be discussing the first essential principle of the Optimizing Outcomes for Students who are Deaf, Hard of Hearing guidelines. Each student is unique. We are so excited again to have you all here and for the layout of TA Live this year. Throughout the year, we'll be discussing the 10 essential principles of the Optimizing Outcomes guidelines. And following the presentation, we'll have a panel of experts who will share their experiences based on each one of the principles. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation portion, please put them in the Q&A box in the Zoom room, so that the panelists can address them during the panel discussion. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. However, we will stop the recording during the panel discussion portion. And for your all's convenience, we have created a LiveBinder for you to access resources for each of the 10 principles and optimizing outcomes. If you've not checked it out yet, it is a beautiful thing. Thank you to Sherry Conrad who put it all together. It really is amazing. Included in the LiveBinder will be the slides for this presentation and the presentation for each month to follow, and the recording of the presentation after it's been through post-production. And also all the resources that we'll be talking about today, and then throughout the rest of the year, all those resources are going to be in that LiveBinder. So what is optimizing outcomes? In case you didn't know, in 2018, the National Association of State Directors of Special Education, or NASD, is what we like to call it, NASDSE, NASD, updated and published the third edition of Optimizing Outcomes for Students who are Deaf or Hard of Hearing. It's a handbook of educational service guidelines. The 10 principles to optimize the education of students who are deaf or hard of hearing are summarized on this slide. But when you read these principles, they can really be applied to any child with a disability. So this book right here is a wonderful resource for building a strong program for students who are deaf, hard of hearing. You can get the guidelines from NASD's website or from the Deaf Ed Guidelines website. They're also in the LiveBinder. So as each principle is highlighted, consider how they apply to both students who are deaf, hard of hearing, as well as every student in your building or district, including those with other disabilities, those who are English language learners, or those with no identified disability or additional need. So I'm going to read off each of the 10 essential principles, but we're really going to focus on the first one today. So the first principle is each student is unique, and we're going to talk about that more in depth. The second is high expectations drive educational program and future employment. So every child can learn, and educators must operate on the least dangerous assumption and presume competence to provide every opportunity for growth. The third principle is families are critical partners. Family involvement not only impacts academic success, but also social, emotional, and communication development as well. The fourth is early language development is critical to cognition, literacy, and academic achievement. Language is key and impacts every aspect of a child's education. The fifth is specially designed instruction is individualized. Students who are deaf, hard of hearing require teaching methods that are highly specialized and focus on their unique needs. The sixth is least restrictive environment is student-based. There's a continuum of services to ensure each child can learn in an environment. The seventh is educational progress must be carefully monitored. Not only must it be monitored, but the assessments that we use must also be accessible, right? The eighth principle is access to peers and adults who are deaf, hard of hearing is critical. Many skills, including language development, require practice, and peers and adult role models are a huge part of that growth. The ninth is qualified providers are critical to a child's success. These providers are often counted among populations in a critical shortage. We all know this. So we must not only recruit, but retain these qualified providers. And the 10th and last, but not least, is state leadership and collaboration is essential. So keeping up to date on current philosophies and trends coming from state initiatives is important, but it's also imperative that districts communicate among each other as well. You all have such wonderful ideas, so share them with each other. So these are the 10 essential principles, and this is what we're going to be discussing throughout this entire year for TA Live for every webinar. But today, let's focus on the first one. So each student is unique. If you've met a student who is deaf, hard of hearing, you've met one student who's deaf, hard of hearing. Every student is different. Just because a strategy, intervention, curriculum, practice, or program work for one student doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for another. The I in IEP means we look at the unique characteristics of each child and design instruction to alleviate barriers presented. So what do you see? What animal do you imagine? I want you to type it in the chat. And if you have been a part of our presentation and have seen this slide before, shh. Sherry Conrad said a llama. Tamberlin said a zebra. Nicole said a zebra. Dawn said a donkey. Elaine said a horse, a cow. I've seen horses. I've seen a donkey. So was it a horse or was it a zebra? Karen said, I want to say zebra because of Karen Anderson. Well, guess what? Karen Anderson, a national leader in deaf education, uses the analogy of zebras and horses to describe the subtle nuances of kiddos who are deaf, hard of hearing. This is mostly to do with thinking about when you hear hoofbeats, you typically think of horses, right? Just like when students who are deaf, hard of hearing are sitting in a classroom, they may look like all the other students or the horses, right? But in fact, they're quite unique and have very specific learning needs, just like zebras are highly specialized and require that care that's different than horses. So many times, a hearing-related disability is mistaken for other disabilities, like it could be mistaken as a learning disorder or attention, ADHD, which is why sensory screening, those hearing and vision screenings, is so important to the evaluation process. So children who are deaf, hard of hearing have learning issues, they're due to access barriers, not due to learning disorders. So we not only know that students who are deaf, hard of hearing are unique, but even those zebras all have their own individual stripes too. Again, if you've met one student who's deaf, hard of hearing, you've met one student who is deaf, hard of hearing. So we need zebra experts to help identify the needs to this highly specialized population. But who are these zebra experts? You guys, you all are. The zebra experts are the teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing, or your audiologists, or your SLPs that are trained in deaf ed strategies. So all these educators who are deaf, who are trained and have expertise in viewing these students through the deaf lens. You guys are the zebra experts. Many professionals at all levels of education have limited experience with kiddos who are deaf, hard of hearing. This phenomenon is further impacted by the highly specialized needs of this unique population. So not only are there not a lot of people who have experience working with students who are deaf, hard of hearing, the manifestations are often so unique in each individual student that many professionals don't even know where to start to support them. Did you know that 1 in 100 students has an IEP, who has an IEP is a student who is deaf, hard of hearing? 1 in 100. So it's important to have an expert able to look through that lens to help it determine the needs of that 1 in 100. One stakeholder in a previous training commented on this principle of each student is unique. And she said, with unique students means unique teaching, resources, strategies, and modalities that need to be provided for equal access to language. And I think that sums it up right there. So what she said, unique strategies, teaching things, right? So on the screen is an array of considerations when developing services for students who are deaf, hard of hearing. Each of these must be carefully considered. That's why the need for specialized personnel who have knowledge in deaf education is critical for the student's growth. There are so many intricate details: hearing status, language proficiency, communication approaches, assistive technology, child and family priorities, communication access, and additional factors that go into serving these students who are deaf, hard of hearing. So why teachers of the deaf? Why are they important? Why do we actually need them? Why can't it just be an ESC teacher? I think NASD said it best in their guidelines and the optimizing outcomes. And they said, even with today's benefits of early identification and intervention and constantly improving technology, educators continue to see children who are deaf or hard of hearing start school without a sufficient linguistic foundation from which to build language, cognition, and literacy skills. Specialists, those are your zebra experts, must analyze and interpret each student's current level of functioning to plan and deliver appropriate services that address the student's language and communication needs as a foundation for successful educational performance. So thinking about that foundation that these students who are entering in without a sufficient linguistic foundation, right? This is another reason why zebra experts are needed, is for quality IEP writing, right? Words are powerful. A simple change can make a huge impact on perception. When we talk about the effects of a student's disability has on their ability to learn, it's important to make sure it's accurately described. So take a moment and look at these two columns and think about the differences. What do you notice is different about these two different columns? Dawn said, I've tried this often. It's not a language impairment. It's lack of exposure to accessible language, not an impairment. Kara said, yes. Yeah, so someone pointed out recently about these two columns, and I thought it was so well said, was that the left column puts the burden on the student, right? The student's hearing loss impacts her receptive and expressive language. The student's hearing loss impacts her language development, access to the curriculum. The student's hearing loss limits her ability to express herself and communicate effectively with others. Whereas the right column puts that responsibility back on those who are working with the student. The student's lack of an accessible language impacts her receptive and expressive language skills, right? It's all the lack of an accessible language. So it's a responsibility of those who work with the student to provide equal access to the language environment. It's not the student's fault that they have that lack of accessible language, right? It's the responsibility of those who are working with the student. So these zebra experts are important because they can help say, is it truly because of the student's hearing loss that they're struggling with these things? Or is it a lack of an accessible language? Yeah, Judah said in the second column, language is emphasized. Precisely, yes. So thinking about language and communication, it's important to know your students' receptive and expressive communication preferences, and not only preferences, but capabilities. So this graphic was created by RMTC based off of an article written in the Odyssey, which is a magazine produced by Gallaudet University. And it's a communication continuum for individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing. You can also find this graphic, this document, in the LiveBinder. So there's a receptive communication continuum, and there's an expressive communication continuum. So how do you use this? Well, if you aren't sure where your student falls on the continuum, there's a tool that you can use. It's called the PARC Instruction Communication Access Checklist. Again, this is in the LiveBinder. This can help you determine where your student falls receptively and expressively on the communication continuum. So for example, this student, it shows that receptively the student accesses information mostly through auditory means, right? Whereas expressively, he communicates fully in ASL. So it's important to know where your students fall in this continuum so that you can be sure to provide equal access to the language environment. So someone might say this student doesn't need an interpreter because he accesses everything mostly auditory. But if you have the data to show, yeah, but he also expresses himself fully in sign, then it might prove that he needs an ASL interpreter, right? So it's all based on individual. This is why each student is unique. Another area that sets our students apart is the use of hearing assisted technology. Personal hearing assisted technology, or HAT, just means that technology is specific to the student, right? Generally, the sound reaches the student through hearing aids or headphones. And in this age of rapid technological development, the personal HAT can be as varied as children who wear them. Yet another reason why Zebra experts are important to help with knowing what kind of hearing assisted technology is needed and how to troubleshoot it. RmHA, or RmHA, pronounced RmHA, is remote hearing assisted technology. This technology provides access to auditory information across a distance, like your FM systems. The ASHA webpage has a great explanation of RmHA versus personal HAT. So definitely take a look at it if you have time. It's in the LiveBinder. Now, did want to touch on this. You might notice there are some Apple AirPods on this slide. Did you know that they have a new hearing aid feature? So cool. Technology, right? But can also be a little dangerous. A student may say, I'm using them as my hearing aids, when really they're listening to music. So just beware. So this rapidly changing technology shouldn't replace quality hearing assisted technology. Let's have a little mythbuster time, okay? If a student has hearing aids, then that's equivalent to remediation, right? They don't need any other kind of interventions, right? Right. Amplification provides access, a pathway, not remediation of missed skills. Also, you can't remediate what isn't there. If there's language gaps because they lack an accessible language, then you can't remediate what they have never learned. Remember, HAT, hearing assisted technology, is simply that, technology. It's important to remember that speech does not equal language. An example of this is my husband was trying to talk to me from the kitchen. Well, I was in the back of the house in the bathroom putting on makeup, okay? He's trying to talk to me. And of course, I yell back, I can't hear you. He comes back and he says, you heard me. You just didn't understand what I was saying. My first thought was, yeah, that's annoying. Second thought was, it's actually really impactful for our students because oftentimes they hear us, but they have to be taught how to make that speech meaningful. So how can they be taught to make that speech meaningful? Guess what? We have standards for that. So we have the expanded skills standards and the speech and auditory training standards. The expanded skills standards were developed to guide the IEP team on how to provide specially designed instruction for students who are deaf, hard of hearing to be able to access the general education instruction based upon the student's needs. And they focus mostly on access, language, self-awareness, and self-determination. Also should be noted that the expanded skills can only be taught by students or by a teacher of the deaf, a certified teacher of the deaf that is certified in deaf, hard of hearing K through 12. Another course that can be taught by a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing can also be taught by SLPs is speech and auditory training. So why might speech and auditory training or why might those standards be important to have collaboration with your speech and language pathologists, your SLPs, and your teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing? Why might it be important to collaborate with speech and auditory training? Judah said they definitely complement each other. Absolutely. So like we discussed in the previous slide, speech does not equal language. So oftentimes our students need to be taught how to listen and taught those auditory discrimination skills. So a lot of times a teacher of the deaf is working on the same skills as the SLP. So that's why it's important to have that collaboration. Judah said, we might see or notice something that the SLP might not with auditory and vice versa. That's beautiful. Very well put. All right, so it all comes down to what? What's one word that you think it all comes down to for our students who are deaf, hard of hearing to make them so unique? Type it in the chat for me. Julie said language. 500 RMTC points for you, Julie. It all comes down to language for our kiddos. At the heart of every conversation has to be the consideration of a student's access to and proficiency in language. Beautiful. All right, now we're going to have our beautiful panel of experts. Elizabeth Barney, who's from Martin County, and she's the ESC program specialist for SLPs and for deaf, hard of hearing. And then Victoria Pope, who's from Orange County, who is a 4th and 5th grade teacher of the deaf in Orange County, and she's also NIC interpreter certified. They're going to go over some case studies while we're still recording, and then we'll have a panel discussion. We'll stop the recording and you can ask questions. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Beth Barney. Beth, you with us?
I am. Hi, guys. How is everybody? Good. Okay. It's kind of weird that it's all silent, but hi. Okay, so this is a very typical situation, very typical DHH student of what we see here in Martin County. So, and I'm sure pretty much everywhere as well, right? So Jacob is one of those kids that really thinks it's no big deal. And his teachers think it's no big deal. I speak loud enough, right? So he must hear me. He's got B's and C's. He says that science and math are his favorite courses. He doesn't particularly like to write. That isn't necessarily a downfall. That's just his personal preference. Yes, the teacher voice, Sherry. Yes. Anyway, he's got a moderately severe mixed hearing loss. It has been progressive since he's been a little boy. He does have hearing aids, but he only needs to wear them for certain classes, or so he says. He does want to go to college. He wants to work part-time after he graduates from high school. But he's not able to tell me who he needs to call for what. He can't tell me the difference between an audiologist and an ENT, what an SLP does, what a teacher of the deaf does. Can't tell me any of that stuff. He just, gets through it, and dad will call when he needs it. He can clean his own hearing aids. He can show me how to replace his batteries, but he doesn't know anything about his hearing loss at all. Like I said, teachers say that he's okay. He's just an average student. He doesn't really need anything. He never advocates for accommodations, so we don't think he really needs them. When I gathered some basic information based on his itinerant rubric, it's only showing him as a consult because that's only as strong as the input from the teachers who say that he's doing fine. And I could tell, yes, it is a zebra that looks like a horse. Absolutely. I could tell that he was obviously uncomfortable. He didn't catch everything that I was saying. He couldn't appropriately answer, and I think he'd like to play that off when he couldn't figure it out. So I kind of want to turn this over to you guys and say, okay, so this is, and I agree, Kara, it's only as strong as people providing the input. So a lot of this is observational. A lot of this is knowing what you don't know, right? So it's kind of hard for Jacob to speak up for himself when he doesn't even know he needs to speak up. He doesn't know that he's missing out on these things. So anyway, so I'm going to turn this over to you guys. This is my snapshot of that typical kid that we underassume, I think, often for. And I want to hear from you all what you guys think, maybe some areas that we could support him appropriately. Or are there areas more than just basic ESE support, if that, because he seems to be doing okay.
All right, so I put in the chat box the questions that we want you guys to answer. So what are possible services this student may need? What more do you want to know about this student? Who's going to monitor this? And who can you reach out to if you don't know? So Don said, does he know the accommodations afforded to him?
So yes, the accommodations, that We can use the classroom FM system like a sound field system. He could have preferential seating if he wants it. But again, being a high school student, what we often hear from these teachers are, well, he doesn't advocate for it, so he probably doesn't need it. It's on him. He should advocate if he wants it. So legally, he attends the IEP meetings. He hears all this. But I don't know if that answers your question that he knows what's afforded to him. Yes, I completely agree with you, Sherry. But unfortunately, I think, and I know where the hearts of people, I know where the hearts of teachers are. So I think that this mindset of, you know, molding these young adults into being more responsible and being more self advantageous, you know, and advocating for what they need. I think their heart's in a right place where they're going, okay, you need to know this. You need to be able to say this for yourself. But again, I go back to the whole, like, they don't know what they don't know. And so it's difficult. And so the last couple of pieces, I'm trying to see what the chat was, and I keep moving around the picture. Sorry. So has he had a functional listening eval and gone over it? That's a very good question. That's one of the tough things about these case studies is that, you know, there's always more questions than what I had the answers for. But let's say he did. Let's say we went over the functional listening eval. Let's say we did go over that. Maybe the functional listening eval wasn't done well, where he saw the difference between an FM system and without one. Maybe it wasn't done well where he just assumed that was only necessary for his classes where women are talking, you know, that kind of stuff. And I do give credit to him for knowing the difference between the two. Increased itinerant service or add support facilitator who's on site. I agree with that. I think that, well, I'm going to let you guys keep talking before I tell you what I propose.
Yeah, our next slide. Let me know when you're ready to go to the next slide, Beth, and I'll go.
Teachers really offered the accommodations in a setting or situation where he may actually take advantage of them? That's a really good question. And I unfortunately think a lot of times at secondary in general, the answer is no. They assume that this student is at the IEP meeting, since he legally has to be there now at this point, then he heard all that and he was told that he needs to advocate for it. And now he has to stick out and raise his hand up to ask for it. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of people are in that mindset. I completely agree, Kara, that one of the things that we should be doing is to teach them that it's okay to do that and to teach them that they should be doing that, you know? I completely agree, Nicole, that they don't want to look weird. Nobody wants to look weird or different or asking for things that the rest of the kids don't, you know? So yeah, absolutely. If you want to jump to the next slide, I have a student ask for notes in the middle of class instead of the start of the action of the class. I like that. Introduce various options for captioning. Ooh, I like that a lot. Yeah, I think a lot of these things, if we would embrace more UDL steps, then it wouldn't be so blatant that there's a zebra in the room. Okay, so yes, so I definitely think, yes, yay. Way to go, UDL for zebras. So language therapy, one of the things that I'm saying, and of course, is I'm an SLP, so I kind of always think about that and talk about, you know, how to be able to do that. So if he dislikes writing, again, I don't want to assume one thing or the other, but a lot of times I see that just because writing's work, you got to organize, you have to have executive functioning skills, you have to have all those language components, all of those pieces, and it does take a while. So maybe that's something that we can help him out with, like organizing and more of that executive functioning level, but pertaining to writing. In our little district, we don't have an audiological overseer on staff. You got me. And so we do contract with an audiologist here locally for any type of evaluations and services, but we don't have her for the educational component, at least not consistently. So the next piece, when I was talking about that either being me as the SLP or the audiologist, of kind of teaching that why to that hearing aid technology, you know, again, talking about that, somebody was saying about implementing the FLE, you know, making sure that he understands that kind of helps with the buy-in, and talking about that progressive hearing loss. That's a big concern for me, especially as he's a 10th grader. moving forward of like, what will that look like? You know, how are you going to prepare for that in any setting? I think a lot of these things are pertinent, especially with his age, and can be very appropriately targeted in a lot of transition or employment goals. So as we're talking about that independence, or as we're talking about that self-advocacy, again, since we have to translate this here in Martin County without a teacher of the deaf or without an itinerant teacher, being able to, how do we support those same targets and be able to pull from that with the current resources that we have on staff? And so does that look like an ESE monitor teacher? Does that look like a transition specialist that's helping him as he's preparing post-secondary? ESE in general, can we help him out with those self-advocacy skills? What does that look like? Can we teach him not only what those accommodations are, but how to use them, how to feel comfortable using them? Can we teach the teachers how to use them and feel comfortable using them? And then the biggest things, ooh, that's a good point, Sherry. So Sherry's saying, is there an adult who can act as a role model, someone who has experienced a progressive loss? I will say that that's something that I have a couple of monitor teachers at the high school levels that themselves have hearing loss, different varying degrees of it. And so they really do like to take these kids under their wings. So I'm happy about that. The downside is that I think that we often assume then that that means that they have this wealth of like DHH background when they really don't. They're just somebody living it, which is awesome. And that's a great perspective. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they can educate them in different areas of this. So yeah, we do have that. And then I think that, my role then, just as the SLP, not necessarily bleeding into the DHH portions, but just as the SLP, is really focusing on that communication piece. So how do we do that functionally? You know, what happens when you are at Panera and you can't hear somebody because there's too much background noise, and you didn't bring your hearing aids because you didn't deem this as one of your places that you think is necessary to be wearing your hat. So what am I doing? And really kind of talking about that functionally, so he doesn't feel lost no matter what his situation is. He's able to communicate. So that's that. And talking about those accommodations then outside of the classroom. I think this is really the big opportune time to talk about that and say, okay, what are you doing? How are you going to do this? Those are my thoughts. Is there anything that I missed that you guys were thinking about? Thanks for that, Kara. Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit. And now that, especially post-COVID, there has been so much, I can't even say like everybody's embraced it, but everybody's gotten more comfortable with Zoom platforms and any type of teleconferencing and that kind of stuff. So I do think that it breaks down some geographical barriers to hook up some of these role models where, in a lot of these smaller, where there isn't a big DHH community necessarily, like Martin County, where we can connect with other people. And I think that's something that we can definitely investigate and utilize more. But Kara had pen pals role models. That's awesome. But yeah, I think that would be something really, really great, and something that we can investigate further this year.
Beth, thank you for that case study. We really wanted Beth to be one of our panelists because she has that SLP background that I think sometimes, like I'm teacher of the deaf, right? I don't have SLP background. I'm teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. So just knowing how valuable our SLPs are, and the fact that she has that, she says she doesn't have all the deaf ed things, but really she's learned very quickly, and she's amazing at what she does in Martin County, especially for not having a teacher of the deaf there. And that's another reason why we wanted her as a panel, or as an expert on this panel, is because she is really the DHH expert in Martin County right now. So thank you, Beth. That was beautifully put. Make sure if you have questions, that you're putting them in the Q&A, because we're going to stop the recording after our next case study, which is going to be Tori Pope. Then we're going to stop the recording and we're going to have that Q&A panel discussion. Okay. All right. So thank you, Beth. You can go ahead and mute and turn off your camera, and then I'll turn it over to Tori.
Hi. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Beautiful. So today we're going to talk about a student. I've named her Jessica. So she's a 5th grade student, and this where we started, she was in 3rd grade. The part that I put on the slide is just from her IEP. It's more of her PLEP, but I'm going to talk more about her as a whole, separate from that. So Jessica came to us. She kind of popped in and out of our program. I should also say I'm in Orange County. We have a cluster site at our elementary school, so we have self-contained DHH classes using a total communication program. So Jessica came to us. She kind of popped in and out. She was there for a bit in 1st grade, and then a little bit at the start of 2nd grade, and then kind of disappeared again. And then she came to us again in 3rd grade. She had attendance issues, and we could kind of tell that she had had attendance issues in the past reading over her cume. She didn't have sign language at home, but sign language was her primary mode of communication, both expressive and receptively. We know she had a lot of word finding issues. She had a bilateral severe to profound hearing loss, and we could tell that she was missing things not expressively or not receptively. When we were signing to her, she was seeming to get the message, and yet when we asked her to expressively communicate what she needed to, she was struggling. She would have a lot of the which in our program was pretty normal. Again, language deprivation is a big thing in our program. And so she was kind of a pretty average DHH student for our program. So this is kind of where we started. She's in 3rd grade, and based on teacher observation, she struggled with print. She reversed letters when she was writing, and also when she was sounding out words, she would flip the beginning and end of words. We noticed that when she was spelling or finger spelling, she would be reversing letters that you would see similar in ASL. For example, A, E, T, L, D, R, E, C, X. Those were all close in hand shape, and she would flip them both when she was writing and when she was finger spelling. She was not confident in reading, and she knew she wasn't a strong reader. She hated to read. You'd pull her aside to read, and she would be like avoidance techniques up the wazoo, like, can I go to the bathroom? Can I get some water? So she really struggled through reading. She struggled to get her thoughts on paper and couldn't retain spelling out a word to her. She was one of those kids that spell cat, C, A, T. You couldn't C-A-T, write C-A-T, which we see a lot with our kids, or we did previously. So she had been reading at beginning kindergarten level for over 2 years. So looking at this student as a whole, what are some possible services that you think she could maybe need? What more do you want to know about her?
Just put those questions in the chat box, the same questions as before. What are possible students services the student may need? What more do you want to know? Who's going to monitor this? And who can you reach out to if you don't know? So let's see what we get in the chat. Tori, do you want to read them in the chat yourself, or do you want me to read them for you? I know sometimes it can be hard to have multiple things.
I know.
So.
Yeah, if you'll shout them out as you see them, that'd be great.
Perfect.
It's funny when Beth was saying that her student was the typical DHH student. It's so funny because for our program, it's so not the typical student, right? Because we are a cluster site. But I know that throughout the state, there are more cases like Beth's than there are like cluster sites.
Right. Dawn said, first thing that comes to mind is direct phonemic awareness instruction.
Yes, Dawn. Fairview.
Thinking of AT, Elizabeth said yes.
Mhm.
Don't get Kara started on her soapbox of AT is more than her use of technology.
I can't
She's not
type as
wrong.
fast. Speaking of AT, so it's me trying to type as quickly as you guys are typing in. But no, what I was getting at is, can she use some sort of like word prediction software? So like if she's getting hung up on the spelling piece of it, but if she's still, supposed to be writing and getting these answers out, is there any way that she can, use some sort of like a co-writer or something like that, that she can spit out her ideas real quick?
That's a good idea. Something that we struggled with, and we struggle with a lot of our, I'd say a lot of our signing students is, when we are talking about like, okay, you have an ASL dictionary, go find the word in the dictionary, is that they don't even know where to start. They don't have the onset letter if they're not sounding out a word. And that was something we've seen her struggle with. So I don't know if that would be as helpful, but that is a very good idea. It might be.
Yeah,
What kind of softwares do you use?
So we have a district-wide AT team still in place, which I love. And I think that would be something that we would play around with. We do use Dragon, Co-Writer, Snap and Read for all of those speech-to-text and text-to-speech pieces. I know that there's a couple other programs that we have used in the past as well. So it would just really be that analytical, evaluatory piece of what works best for this child, and if that's appropriate. But I'm just thinking about that because a lot of those word prediction softwares, and I know that would be not allowable then on FSA and that kind of stuff, but a lot of those word prediction pieces, at least, not only predicts the words for phonetic spelling, but it also predicts those words as grammatically correct as well. Like, so as the words are coming up, it's proposing different, like how your phone is when you're texting, like the words that you typically use next.
Yeah.
So my thought process is that may be, and then coming from the SLP side, all of that boosts the phonics piece of it as well. So like the actual reading part to it, that can only help her ability to do all of that.
Awesome. And getting your SLP involved was exactly what we did. Not that our SLP was not involved to begin with. Our SLP, we are very fortunate. She's very involved. She's been with us for, I don't even know how long before I was here. And she's also a signing SLP, which are few and far between, which we're very fortunate to have her. Sherry said, I'd be curious to know if the student had been evaluated for any additional disabilities. Is there an SLD at play that hasn't been addressed? And that's what we thought too. Do you have a reading specialist? I wish, Kara. I wish I was the reading specialist. Let's see, local assistive technology specialists, teachers of the deaf should be BFFs. I like that. So we looked into strategies of children with dyslexia. Dyslexia was the first thing that we were thinking, especially with her flipping her letters. So that was something that we talked about once we met, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on our next slide.
I just want to touch base on the specific language or specific learning disability and DHH because, again, we talked about, and during my presentation part, we talked about how deaf hard of hearing can oftentimes look like other disabilities, right? It can look like a specific learning disability, it can look like attention deficit disorder, when really, so it's sad that you say, Tori, that your typical student who's deaf hard of hearing really equals language deprivation, is what your typical one looks like. And that's really sad, right? And that's where that specific learning disability can look like when really it's language deprivation. So just wanted to touch base on that. But that, I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
And I saw it too, because I came from a self-contained setting too, and that was my typical student as well.
Yeah,
it meant that they were language deprived, and it was just how it was. And now it's sad that it shouldn't be like that. So
yeah, very often we have kind of an assumption that what's going on is language deprivation, when we really need to look at it with a critical eye and kind of rule out if there is something else going on other than that.
Right. Now, that's not to say that a student cannot have an SLD, because they can absolutely, a student who's deaf hard of hearing can absolutely also have a specific learning disability, for sure. Yes.
Correct.
But it oftentimes can be mistaken as such.
So what we did is we met as a team. And when I say team, this included our program specialist for the county. She's wonderful. She oversees like a million departments, one of which is deaf and hard of hearing. And she works really hard to advocate for our DHH kids. Our SLP, our principal, we have 2 audiologists that are specific to Orange County and 2 that specifically come to our school. A team of itinerant teachers, the previous year's teacher, and the incoming teacher. And so at the end of every school year, we do case reviews where we talk about every single student that is in our program with this team, and we try and figure out if we're on the right track with them, or if there's some interventions that we need to put into place. And when we were talking about Jessica, we were stressed out. She was in 3rd grade going into 4th. She was reading at a kindergarten level. She'd break down during FSA testing. We were concerned. And so we talked about, okay, is this a student who's SLD? Is this a student who has dyslexia? And so we, that year, we're starting an intervention program, Fairview, which someone mentioned in the previous chat. And we also started using finger spelling our way to reading. And one of the other things we decided to do, thanks to our program specialists and their itinerant team, is we gave formal American Sign Language instruction. And we decided to do this and reevaluate with this student throughout the year. That was in 4th grade. I looped with the student, so I had her in 4th and 5th grade. And the change that we saw was astounding. The phonemic awareness skills that she got with finger spelling our way to reading made it so that her spelling retention was no longer an issue. If you chunked a finger spelled word to her correctly, she could retain it, hold on to it, write it then, write it the next day, which was something that she could never do before. With Fairview strategies, she applied those throughout her whole, all of her academic areas. She would take a science text and she would bridge them, which I don't know if all of you are familiar with Fairview. That's just one of the strategies that they teach. She blossomed. Her favorite subject is reading. So this is kind of her current plep or plop. Jessica's now reading at an end of 2nd grade level. She reads with an average accuracy of 90% and an average comprehension of 96%. She's the first to volunteer to read and reads with pride. Her word retention and writing skills have increased using the finger spelling our way to reading strategies, and her signing has become more clear, and she grasps the concept of multiple meaning words and bridge phrases with confidence. She was recognized in Orange County for improving her FSA ELA scores from 2018 to 2019. So bridging phrases, yeah, those are English phrases that have one sign. For example, once upon a time is an English phrase that only has one sign. And so before then, we started teaching Fairview, she would sign word for word, and her comprehension was just slim to none. And when applying these Fairview strategies, her comprehension skyrocketed. Also, giving her formal ASL instruction was filling in those language deprivation gaps that were so evident. And so with all of this, we ruled out SLP and dyslexia, or SLP, SLD and dyslexia, along with assessments that were put into place with our itinerant crew. So that's, oh, sorry, I accidentally turned my music on there. So that's what we saw with this one student.
Tori, that's beautiful. I mean, just beautiful. I mean, so many people in the chat was like, this gives me chills and this is awesome. But I mean, it really is amazing to see really what research-based strategies and interventions can really, how they can help a student who is deaf, hard of hearing.
And I'd like to say too that this particular student was one that we saw a really big jump in. She was not alone. We did implement this strategy as an entire program, which is part of what made it so successful, is that it was carrying on throughout the years. Our SLP was involved, our itinerants were involved. So when students were in mainstream classes or the general education classes, they were using the same strategies as well. So she is not so unique in that she was the only kid that we saw these gains with. It was just, she was a particularly special case.
Beautiful. I love the collaboration. I mean, that's goes back to that, what we talked about is collaboration with your SLPs and your whole DHH IEP team is so important. So that's ideal and beautiful. Thank you, Beth Barney and Tori Pope, for being our panel experts for this TA Live webinar. Your expertise and experience help truly show that each student is unique. Thank you for watching this TA Live webinar. RMTC-DHH is a Florida Department of Education, Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services discretionary project, and all of the services we provide are at no cost to Florida stakeholders. To continue our work, we must collect survey data to justify why our services are needed. If you could please complete our survey, we would greatly appreciate it. You can keep in touch with RMTC-DHH by following us on social media, and we have a Vimeo and YouTube channel with a plethora of videos of our presentations, our TA Live webinars, and some additional videos demonstrating working with students who are DHH. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at info@rmtcdhh.org.